Dear friends, today we are here to discuss the latest report by by Professor Salvatore Babones, who needs no introduction. He has written a paper in the Quadrant Magazine titled "Unholy Alliance: Inside the Campaign to Pry Against India." He's talked about an unholy alliance against India, and let's start with Professor Babones. Professor Babones, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for
Yeah,
the invitation, as always.
yeah, and let's start with your latest report, in which you have, which is a very detailed report on an unholy alliance which is targeting India, and you've given a lot of proof and evidence and facts behind it. So, if you could just mention the major points in your report.
Well, first, I don't give a lot of proof and facts about the Unholy Alliance. All of that is implicit. That is, it's something that's there in the data that you can't necessarily point to, but it's very easy to recognize. And that is that we see the experiences of Christian missionaries in India being reported to the U.S. State Department. That is then picked up by NGOs who say that religion is not free in India. And then that gets amplified by Islamists, international Islamists, who say, look, we told you religion was not free in India. There's going to be a Muslim genocide. And the irony is that all of the supposed data, and I say supposed because we have a lot of questions about these data, all the supposed data underlying this has to do with the supposed ill treatment of Christian missionaries, yet it's being portrayed in public as if it's poor treatment of Indian Muslims. Now, I keep using weasel words like supposed because we actually know it's not true. We have good, hard data on Christian missionaries in India and their ability to practice, or at least we have data on hate crimes against Christians in India, and we know that levels of hate crimes against Christians in India are substantially lower than levels of hate crime we see against religious groups, like, for example, against Jews in the United States. So we know that although there are hate crimes against Christians in India, they're very rare compared to what happens in other countries. Second, we know that India's Muslims are not facing undue levels of systemic discrimination. And that may seem like an outrageous claim to make. And you might say, Salvatore, how can you, white American sociologists living in Australia say that Muslims are not facing high levels of discrimination in India? And I know that because we have absolutely rock solid survey data on this. The Pew Research Center in 2019-2020 did a massive survey in India, cost them more than $2 million. They surveyed 29,999 households. Now imagine that, one short of 30,000, all over the country. Is a nationally representative sample representing more than 99% of India by population. The survey was only not conducted in a few areas that had ongoing conflict. So this broadly represents India's population. They had an 86% response rate, which means we don't have problems that you often see in telephone surveys or internet surveys, that maybe there's a response bias of who's willing to answer the survey. An 86% response rate. And what they found was that 89% of India's Muslims and 89% of India's Christians report that they are, quote unquote, very free to practice their religion. Only 2% say they are unfree to practice their religion. And 2%, remember, in any survey, there's always somebody who misunderstood the question. There's always somebody who has a complaint. I mean, an answer of 2% for any question on a survey is almost unheard of. It means that the number of Muslims and Christians who feel they're not free to practice their religion in India is vanishingly small.
Professor Babones, I also want to ask this, that you've made a mention of the fact that the same kind of narrative that has been peddled against Israel, and if we can use the words like anti-Semitism and anti-Israel narrative, now the same kind of toolkits are being used by a similar set of people against India and Hindus. So could you tell us a bit more about that as well?
It's clear that anti-Hindutva has become the new anti-Zionism. We know that for decades, people who have not wanted to be tainted with the accusation of anti-Semitism, but who are actually anti-Semitic, have used anti-Zionism as a proxy for attacking Jews and Israel when what they really are anti-Semitic. Now, that's not to say that everyone who's anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. There are many Jews who are anti-Zionist. It's a perfectly legitimate position to be anti-Zionist, but that's the point. It's a perfectly legitimate position, so you can cover your anti-Semitism by simply advocating anti-Zionism. And most people agree, and even the BBC's own explainer on anti-Zionism points out that it's well understood that anti-Zionism has become a screen for anti-Semitism. Well, in the same way, we're seeing anti-Hindutva activism being used as a screen for anti-Hinduism. Now, again, the reason it's being used as a screen is anti-Hindutva activism is a perfectly legitimate position. You can oppose Hindutva. There's nothing wrong with that from a moral standpoint. It's not like being anti-Hindu, which is, of questionable morality, would be unacceptable in today's society. Being anti-Hindutva is something you can do respectably. However, because being anti-Hindutva is something you can do respectably, people who are in fact anti-Hindu use anti-Hindutva activism as a screen for their activities. How many of them do? I can't say. Are all anti-Hindutva activists anti-Hindu? I certainly not. That's not the case. But the extreme levels of anti-Hindutva passion that we see among people who have no connection to Hinduism is just remarkable. And when we line it up with anti-Zionism, that we see the same organizations, in some cases the same very people who've taken up anti-Zionist causes in the past, now taking up anti-Hindutva causes today, the circumstantial evidence is, I think, overwhelming that anti-Hindutva activism has simply become a proxy for people's anti-Hinduism, which is not reputable, no longer reputable to express publicly.
Professor Babones, I have a question for you. Don't you think that it's kind of you have said that it's the same people repeating the same toolkit, but against a different community or religious group or nation? Like, what would motivate these strange bedfellows to come together? Because right now we are seeing extreme Christian missionaries or activists coming together with the Islamists. Like, how are they? Is it like you scratch my back, I scratch your back kind of relationship, or is there something really sinister going on?
Well, strange bedfellows is the word that we use for this, because we are finding people who are fighting in other venues. So Christian missionary groups and Islamists are really at each other's, well, I won't say at each other's throats, but they're at loggerheads. They're strongly conflicting in places like Somalia and Yemen, places where Christian missionaries have wanted to operate but face severe restrictions. In particular, I know that in Somalia, because I've family connections to missionaries who are working in Somalia, people aren't even allowed to tell others, missionaries are not even allowed to tell others that they're Christian. That is, they go and they perform relief services in this war-torn country without even acknowledging their religion, because if they do, they'll be kicked out of the country. So they're all over the Muslim majority world where Christian missionaries want to operate. They face severe restrictions that are at odds with Islamists who would rather see the missionaries kicked out of the country. However, everybody in politics makes alliances when they have to, and we see this alliance when it comes to India, that in India, Christian missionary groups, and again, these are mostly international groups, I'm not talking about local Christians in India, and I want to stress this repeatedly. As I stressed in the quantitative segment, Christians in India report being very happy in India. 99% of India's Christians and 99% of India's Muslims report they are proud to be Indian. The issue here is not Indian Muslims and Indian Christians. The issue here is international Christian missionaries aligning with international Islamists strategically to build a negative narrative around India, because they view India, the Indian state, and more broadly Hindu society in India, as a shared opponent. Not because these two groups have anything themselves in common, but because they share, at least they perceive that they share a common enemy, and so they work together. And look, I know these just sound like rants or allegations of because I keep saying we don't have hard data. Let me give you a practical example of how we see this. The same Pew Research Center that did the quantitative survey of freedom of religion in India, in their international religious freedom reports produced by a different group at the same organization, that group that does the international religious freedom reports, first of all, doesn't mention that they have hard data showing that India has very high levels of religious freedom. So that's the first red flag. Second, they're going to U.S. State Department international religious freedom reports to get data about allegations of religious repression in India. Okay, so they go to those State Department reports. Those State Department reports are overwhelmingly dominated, I mean, by a factor of 1,000 to 5, overwhelmingly dominated by complaints made by Christian missionary groups and Christian NGOs about poor treatment in India. So of the more than 1,000 issues raised in those international freedom reports, international religious freedom reports relating to India, in the last report, I think it was 5 had to do with Muslim complainants. I think there were 3 to do with Hindu complainants, and more than 1,000 to do with Christian complainants. Because, of course, who's going to complain to the U.S. State Department? Not your local. I mean, if a Muslim in India feels that she's faced discrimination, she's unlikely to go to the U.S. State Department to complain. It's only a Christian missionary group that's likely to go to the U.S. State Department. All right, so we have these State Department reports that are just incident after incident after incident, and then literally bundled hundreds of incidents in a single line reported having to do with Christian missionaries. The Pew Research Center, its International Religious Freedom Report, then uses this raw data and compiles a report about freedom of religion in India. In their report, they don't mention anything about problems facing Christians. They say India faces severe problems of freedom of religion, and they cite a series of examples that have to do with the treatment of Muslims. Now, if their underlying data on which they're basing the conclusion that India does not have religious freedom, they're basing that conclusion on underlying data that's more than 95%, probably more than 99% reports about repression of Christians. Yet in their analysis of this report, they're exclusively pulling up examples of treatment of Muslims in India. Now that clearly says somebody has an agenda, right? This is not a dispassionate report author trying to find the truth. This is someone who's saying, I can use these large number of reports to support a conclusion of severe repression, and I can use these tiny number of Muslim complaints to produce a narrative saying that it's repression against Muslims. Yet when someone reads the report coming out from a prestigious NGO and sees this report and it says religious freedom is under severe threat in India, worst country in the world for social hostility to religion, and it's Muslims who are being targeted, the person reading the report is getting, first, a warped view of reality, because they have the quantitative data that says it's not true. And second, they're even getting a warped sense of the qualitative reports. That is, at no point are they getting simply an honest reporting. They're getting reporting that's been specifically massaged to take Christian complaints and use them to generate a Muslim complaint to vilify India.
Professor Babones, you mentioned a point, and I would like to follow on with that. That these strange bedfellows see Indian society or Hindu society as a common enemy, and you also mentioned in your report that this alliance tends to undermine international democratic solidarity. Could you elaborate on those 2 points as to why they would see Indian society or Hindu society as an opponent, and how this alliance is actually undermining democratic values around the world?
This is people instrumentalizing the architecture of what's ultimately a well-meaning set of reports. I mean, the whole purpose of U.S. international religious freedom reporting, the whole purpose of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is to ensure that religious freedom is supported around the world by the tools of U.S. power. And okay, that may be neocolonialist to some extent, but it's a noble aspiration. However, what we've seen is the goals for which these organizations have been set up being undermined by people who feel they can get political advantage by taking advantage of the low level of monitoring and the low level of knowledge that the rest of society has about what's going on behind the scenes in these reports. So they're in effect corrupting human rights processes, corrupting what are ultimately pro-democratic processes. I mean, we want people to be free all over the world. They're corrupting those processes in order to attack a democratic country when they should be using these processes, of course, to condemn non-democratic countries. That is, the places we should be seeing targeted by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom are those places that most repress international religious freedom. I mean, it's right there in the name of the commission. So when we see the tools of democracy and the tools of human rights being used primarily and overwhelmingly to attack two democracies, I mean, those tools are used to attack Israel, and those tools are used to attack India. They're not being used to attack the world's repressive regimes, except China. I mean, China comes in for bad press in these reports, but in general, they're not being used to attack the world's most repressive regimes for their repression of freedom of religion. That's got to be bad for democracy around the world. Democracies should be supporting each other, not letting their bureaucratic machinery being used specifically to target other democracies. Now, of course, democracies should be criticized where democracies do wrong. And I always emphasize in these discussions, because I'm very wary of being used as a tool by any side in these political debates. I'm not a Hindu, I'm not Indian. I have no connection to this. I'm simply calling out what's so obvious if you take the 4, 5, 6, 10 hours to read the reports, to read through the raw data, and these patterns jump out immediately. I'm calling out mendacity. I'm not standing for India. I'm not defending Hindus. I've had all of these credits online that don't belong to me. All I'm doing is calling out obvious mendacity that was obvious to anybody else who would take the time to closely read these reports.
Now, Professor Babones, one of the things that these reports and also some other reports do mention is that large number of people still believe that India is a very tolerant society. It's, despite its problems, it is democratic.
Of course.
Recently, we had, quoting India's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar, an old, rich, and very dangerous funder who says that we need to bring democracy into India. So on one hand, you have one or two instances of emergency in India, not under the Hindutva, the so-called Hindutva government or Hindu nationalist government, but under the so-called secular party. And you have a clear, every 4 to 5 years, you have elections being done, political landscape being changed from newcomer parties to old established parties, getting a chance to govern a state or the country. But in the end, you still have this narrative, which is coming out from the left Islamist Christian missionary cabal, especially situated in the US, that India is not a democratic country. Now, you're a man of facts. So how do you manage to juggle between these two narratives?
Oh, look, first of all, I don't think the George Soros the statements about India deserve quite the level of attention they've received. And let's be honest, one of the reasons they've received so much attention is precisely that Dr. Jaishankar, I think, scented political advantage in criticizing George Soros. And Soros has very little influence over Indian democracy. The organizations he funds may have some influence, but his statement criticizing India would simply have melted away had the Indian government itself not seen electoral advantage in being a victim of George Soros. So look, take the Soros thing with a grain of salt. That said, where does Soros get the idea that India is not a democracy? I mean, he certainly hasn't spent years studying Indian democracy. He's getting it, I suspect, from his own Indian vice president of his Open Society Foundation. And when we look behind all of these Western criticisms of Indian democracy, you repeatedly find Indian names. Now, I can't tell you whether they're Indian origin, if they are Indian citizens, NRIs, if they If they simply have names that happen to sound very Indian, after all, my name is Salvatore Babones, but I'm neither Greek nor Italian. I'm 100% American, and my ties with those countries are very, very distant. However, the circumstantial evidence really can't be ignored. The Pew report that stigmatizes India for international religious freedom was authored by someone with an Indian name. The op-eds that appear in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post that routinely vilify India, most of them, I would say 80% of the op-eds that specifically criticize India are written by people with Indian names. So although when you hear the mouth speaking the words may be George Soros, where are Westerners getting these ideas? They're getting the ideas from their friends, their colleagues, their acquaintances who are of Indian origin. They're getting the idea that India is not a democracy from people who do feel passionately about Indian democracy and who do know the country well. That is, primarily they're getting their knowledge of India from Indians. And that's why this phrase that went viral 3 months ago when I said India's intellectuals are anti-India, and that was criticized from both left and right as, how could you say this? From one side, you're endangering intellectuals. The other side saying, what about my favorite writer? Isn't he an intellectual too? And it's, look, guys, everyone knows what I mean. What I mean by that is that the small number of elite Indian intellectuals who have access to international institutions, who have close friends among the international elite, tend to be people who are very vehemently opposed to the current government in India and who have let their opposition to the current government spill over into a criticism of the Indian state itself, presumably on the theory that only a flawed democracy could have re-elected Narendra Modi.
Professor Babones, you brought up, that line about Indian intellectuals poisoning India, and I remember our interview very clearly. And I think one of the things that we have been discussing is that this is not just about academic discourse. This has real-world implications. And now we are seeing, say, for instance, in Australia, we are seeing, Khalistani attacks on Hindu temples, and now they've gone so far as to, attack the Indian consulate in Brisbane. Where do you see all of this going? Because it seems that the Australian authorities are not taking this threat as seriously. One cannot presume. I don't want to say anything, but it is very difficult to believe that if something like this, say, would have happened on the American consulate, or if a synagogue or mosques were being vandalized in this fashion in Australia, that the police would take such a lackadaisical attitude as it seems to be at this stage. I am not privy to the investigation they're doing, but this is a perception that one has.
Look, obviously, I can't know how serious police are taking things because investigations take time. There hasn't been a lot of public talk about this, but I'm not sure if another country, I'm not sure if this were another country, if we would see more severe action or not. It's really hard to tell. What I can say is that in Australia, Khalistan has not had the Khalistan issue has not had the same purchase that it has had in Canada. That is, it's just starting to bubble into Australia. There have been first the attacks and the violence in Melbourne, now this issue in Brisbane with the consulate. But it's been relatively low level violence compared to what we've seen in Canada. And I think in Australia, there's much more of a learning experience going on with the police. That is, I suspect that before this year, Australia's police forces had never heard of Khalistan. They had no idea what it was. I think they're probably still on a learning curve. The Australian press only first reported the word Khalistan, as far as I can tell. I think it was in December of 2022, and that word had never appeared in the Australian press, other than in press reports from Canada, but had never appeared in the local Australian media, other than the Australia Today. But I mean, not in the ethnic media, but in the not in the diaspora media, but in the mainstream media. So the awareness is only just starting to creep in Australia. And my impression, my strong impression, is that in Australia, there's not the same tolerance for this that there is in Canada. In Canada, militant Sikhs are a large, what Indians call a vote bank. They're a large voting pressure group. They're even represented. There are relatively militant Sikhs who are even in government in Canada. That's something you don't see in Australia. In Australia, the Sikh community as a whole, I think, is much more reasonable. I don't. Khalistan seems to be coming to Australia from Canada, from abroad. It's only now that the Australian authorities are just learning about what it is. So I think it's too soon to judge the Australian authorities negatively on this. I think they're open to learning, and I think it's really important for people like you, the Australia Today, and for people like me. We're starting a think tank in Sydney called the Indian Century Roundtable, where we'll try to be a source of objective opinion for the Australian media and the Australian government on issues like this. So I think it's too early to judge the Australian establishment on this. The issue has just broken into the country in the last 3 months. Give them a few months. Let's check the performance back in June and see how it's going.
Now, you kind of broke my heart when you said that we are not mainstream media. We consider the Australia Today, we consider ourselves
The reason
the
why we
mainstream
brought that
media.
up also
They're
was
not the
because
Australian or the Sydney Morning Herald. Again, let's what the
Yeah.
intellectuals term. Let's not. Everyone knows what we mean when we say mainstream media. You know that the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, Sky News, Channel 7, Channel 9. When you get on cable and you have your own cable channel, then I'll say, okay, you're the mainstream media. Right now, there's nothing. It's not a compliment to say that you're in the mainstream media.
Yeah, no, but we are there somewhere. But the thing that you interestingly mentioned about the Khalistan movement, and especially the vandalism and the actual terrorizing of peaceful people on Melbourne streets at Federation Square, where they created that this Federation Square is our space now, right? So somewhere I was reading your paper, Unholy Alliance, and I was wondering, it's not just the Islamist, the anti-Israel lobby, Christian missionary, it's also the Khalistani militant Sikhs, as you call them, the Khalistani terrorists, who are also playing by the same toolkit, the same book, the playbook, which they have got from somewhere from the Palestinian, the Hamas kind of, people who are active in US and Canadian universities. So somewhere they attack you, then they hide behind and they play the victim card. They hide behind the peaceful Sikh community, not the community that is actually supporting the Khalistanis. And we have seen this with the Islamists as well, who hide behind peaceful Muslims who just want to live their life in US peacefully. They want to go to the education, work, and all those things. But so how does the toolkit that everyone is able to use, everyone is able to identify, but no one is able to call out? How is it that the authorities they don't have policy or research makers like you advising them, or the people who are advising are part and parcel of the same groups who support Khalistan Islamists and Christian missionaries, and now they have taken, so they are basically sleeper cell kind of advisors for these guys, and they have taken prominent position in, say, government authorities?
Government and societal machinery takes time to respond. And let's face it, the Khalistan movement is brand new to Australia. It may have been bubbling along at an extremely low level before December, but it's only really broken out in a serious way in Australia this year. And it will take time for people to learn up on the new threat. And that's natural. And I think, there's a responsibility on those who know something about it. And here I don't mean primarily me. I'm no expert on the Khalistan movement. There are people in Australia who are experts on the Khalistan movement, and they're the ones who we need to be getting in front. Not we, I mean, you need to be getting in front of you, and that Australia has to be getting in front of its policymakers. And I think that's happening. I mean, we've seen reports on Khalistan come out in the Australian, in Australia's highest circulation newspaper, and that's something that is a real, that's a real indication that the issue has come onto the national stage. There are always going to be groups that, unsavory groups that bubble below the radar screen because, the attention of the news and the attention of the police, it can only go so far. I mean, there are many hate groups in society. There are many groups that would want to disrupt disrupt civil society. And until now, we haven't seen anything coming out of Khalistan in Australia that's really very disruptive. So if you imagine all the kinds of groups that police are worried about that will cause disturbances, until now, Khalistan has been not even on that list. They probably had never heard of it. You may be very aware of it because you're of Indian origin, but ordinary, the police machinery wouldn't have known about it. Now it'll take time for them to judge what's going on. It'll take time for them to react. That's perfectly natural. I mean, remember, political dissent is perfectly legal in a democracy. Demonstrating about foreign countries is perfectly legal. On International Human Rights Day, there was a massive march. Probably, I estimated. I'm not an expert in crowd estimation, but at minimum 10,000 people and probably more marching for human rights in Iran, for women's rights in Iran. Well, that kind of, now that was a peaceful protest. There was no violence in that whatsoever. But that sort of movement is so much bigger than, the anti-Iranian government movement, the women's rights movement in Iraq for Iran is much bigger in Australia than the Khalistan movement, which means that it's only when the Khalistan movement starts to get violent that the police are going to take notice, because it's the big movements that are going to attract police attention and make sure there's no disorder involved. And now we're going to see it get on the radar screen, and it should. So I think everything is progressing. It may not satisfy people who have been victims of this kind of agitation, but let's be honest, the level of violence at this point has been very low. It's rising. That's what the worry is. And police will respond as that violence rises, but always with a lag time.
Professor Babones, just the concluding question on this. The reason why we brought this up is because, do you reckon that if this kind of fake and false narrative against India was not being propagated, say for the last 7-8 years, that the reaction of the authorities with regards to the Khalistani threat might have been different? Because we have been reporting it over and over again for the past 1 year, and what we saw in Melbourne was, in my opinion, quite unprecedented. I mean, there are protests, there are counter protests and things like that, and protesting is a democratic right. But the impunity with which some people thought that they could carry out violence was very shocking. And just a concluding question: that do you think that if this narrative, fake narrative against India, was not being built for the past 7-8 years, that perhaps the politicians and the government and the police might have reacted differently? Because we have to make this distinctions. Sikhs are not Khalistanis. They are two very different people. Khalistanis are a very small minority of people who have a militant ideology and allegedly supported by Pakistan's ISI.
Australia has sought to become a multicultural society, and part of becoming a multicultural society, as opposed to a melting pot society like the United States, is accepting that there are going to be intercultural conflicts of which mainstream society simply is unaware, or that it doesn't comprehend. I think the first reaction among mainstream Australian institutions to the Hindu-Sikh confrontations that went on at the Khalistan protests is just ignorance, right? That what's going on? Who are these people? What are they fighting about? That is, for most Australians, Indian Australians are just Indian Australians, whether they're Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, it doesn't matter. They're just Indian Australians. And there's an assumption that, well, all Indian Australians are from India. Don't they all get along? And of course, the truth is that people bring their conflicts excuse me, they bring their conflicts from other countries into Australian society, and it's a learning curve for Australian society to become aware of the conflicts that they have imported. Now, you report from the standpoint that, of course, Khalistan is implicitly wrong somehow. For us as non-Indians, as Westerners, there's nothing from my point of view that is necessarily wrong about people wanting an independent Khalistan. I don't endorse it, but it's, there have been independence movements all around the world. And of course, India had an independence movement, and I wouldn't have opposed in 1945. I wouldn't have said, why are all these Indians demanding independence? It's wrong of them. So I have no particular position on Khalistan, nor will the Australian police, nor will Australian society. What we have a position on is peacefulness. We all want peaceful expression of political opinion. So the first challenge for the police is to understand, okay, we know there was a confrontation in Melbourne. Who was to blame for that confrontation? Who actually committed violent acts first? Was there provocation? Was there potential provocation of one side by the other? It's not as obvious to the rest of us as it may be to you where the provocation is coming from, and we have to be very careful not to rush to judgment. And of course, we'll see these processes work through the law, but I think you just have to be patient and engage in that educational effort that's important in a society like Australia to educate the mainstream society about what these issues are, what's happening. And you can't expect that other people will simply condemn someone because you put the label Khalistan on them. People will condemn others because they're violent, because they're uncivil, because they break the law, but not because they are quote unquote Khalistani.
Professor Babones, for instance, the foreign minister of Australia, I think there was a statement when Dr. Jaishankar was there that we will respect the sovereignty of nations. So when when at a political level you are saying that we respect sovereignty of nations, there is an expectation that if there is a secessionist movement, a separatist movement, forget even a violent one, even a peaceful one. If you say we respect the sovereignty of a nation, it is understood that you will not allow separatist groups against that nation operating on your soil. Protest is fine.
I'm sorry, but that's just not understood. The state of Australia respects the sovereignty of the state of India. That does not mean that the state of Australia will repress its own citizens and residents if they express objections to the sovereignty of India. It's perfectly legal in Australia to question the sovereignty of India, to advocate the breakup of India, to advocate the violent overthrow of governments in India. All of this is perfectly legal in Australia or in the United States or in Canada or in any country that has an Anglo-American legal heritage. That may be unpalatable or undesirable to some people who are not embracing this heritage, but no. The simple fact is that it's perfectly legal in Australia to advocate an end to the sovereignty of the state of India, and no Australian government is going to attempt to prevent those expressions of opinion.
But now, one of the things that we saw, Pallavi, one of the things that we saw, it's very easy to give lecture to other countries during the CAA and farm protest when Trudeau of Canada very magnanimously came on media and said,
Trudeau,
you should
yes.
allow people to protest. And as soon as the truckers' protest happened in Canada, he banned the bank accounts. He asked people not to be present. So somewhere I'm quoting you from your paper that Western democracies owe it not only to India, but to their own self-interest to get the record straight. So if Australia, Canada, USA, or UK or European countries, if they are following one policy towards one particular group, and if India follows the similar policies, say towards the French-dominated Canadian provinces where they want separatism, or say Western Australia or Tasmania, when it happens at some point of time, they want, or Texas in US, then they will have to support and go by the same policy of respecting sovereignty and the ideology, peaceful protesters and whatnot. So I kind of agree with your statement that Western democracies have to come on one platform and follow the same principles as they preach to India. And I think somewhere Jaishankar has been saying that Europe's problems are not India's problem and India's problems are not Europe's problem. So we have to, somewhere mutually agree. Now, it would be, not worth our, you are in India right now, and you have been traveling with Rajdhani, and I'm seeing your tweets with the food, especially. So how's the food? Are you okay?
How's the food? Look, first of all, Justin Trudeau is a politician. he's made an electoral calculation in Canada that it makes sense for him to weigh in on Palestine issues in India. I think everyone in the diplomatic community agrees that it was diplomatically inappropriate for him to do so. That said, politicians make political decisions. What I'm talking about are state and NGO institutions, not individuals, not politicians, institutions. If we have democracy, if we have institutions that are created to promote religious freedom, those institutions should be dedicated to honestly promoting religious freedom. And we should be very careful about seeing them politicized when they're supposed to be non-political institutions. Their purpose for existing is to be outside politics, to be non-political institutions. And that's what we're talking about with USCIRF. That's what we're talking about with the Pew Research Center. These are supposed to be organizations that seek the truth and that promote a cause of religious freedom, not a cause of political gain for Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden or any particular political leader. And that's what my paper is fundamentally about. Now, here in India, talking about the paper, yes, the Rajdhani Express, at last, we get to the main event. I was shocked to receive a free meal in second class on this Indian sleeper train. I wasn't on this train overnight, but it was a sleeper train. I got this free meal. It was fantastic. It was some of the best Indian food I've ever had. It's much better than the business class food on on Air India, and just incredible. And then I had the food. I was looking at it, taking a photo. The porter was worried. He asked somebody, "Is everything all right?" And the guy translated and said, "Oh, he just likes the food." Then the porter said, "Oh, you like the food? Take a selfie with me." And so he did a selfie. And then I showed eating all the food, and it went. I mean, it was reported in every major newspaper in India, which was just incredible. My tweet that first class meal in second class on the Rajdhani Express, and it was a lot of fun. And it was great to have that that human to human moment in India. Even if we couldn't speak the same language, we could eat the same food, and it was really great. And then, of course, the kicker was after I finished the food, I was doing the tweet. I was literally typing the tweet. Ice cream arrived, and so I said, "Oh, update, and free ice cream." So that was a lot of fun.
So when you're traveling within India, to a particular festival, do you interact with the common people, or is it just
the common people? We're all common people. Yes, and actually, I find the VIP culture in India just a bit ridiculous. So at each of the festivals I've been to, there is a special VIP tent for the VIPs to sit separately. There's separate VIP seating, and I just think the whole point of coming to the festival as a speaker is to meet the people you're speaking with. So at the Art Festival, I'm currently at the Art Festival in Delhi. If you're in Delhi, please come see us today and tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday. And there I've just been out with the crowd and taking selfies, and just all day. I've got to get going soon, so I got to get over to the festival, and all day just hanging out with people and talking, taking selfies, chatting. I'm not presenting at the Art Festival today. I'm hanging out at the Art Festival today, and it's just such a great pleasure not to sit. I have no interest in going and sitting in a VIP seating section or hanging out in the VIP tent. I want to talk to people and meet people, and so if you're in Delhi, please come by, and we'll have a nice chat. Maybe share some. Maybe get some food, though not as good as on on the Rajdhani Express. That's for sure.
Yeah. And just to conclude, Professor Babones, that besides your academic work, did you have any impressions about India when you were coming? And how has your experience been? Like, is India similar to what you had in mind, or it's very different from thought it would be?
Well, obviously, as a monolingual English speaker, I don't have much of a genuine experience of India. I do try to get away from minders as much as possible to enjoy some of real society. So I was invited by friends to tour the Vishwanath temple in Varanasi with them. That was a really wonderful experience, and feeding milk to the god, to Shiva. I had a wonderful experience along the Ganges. Again, I got away from everybody, just walked down to the Ganga and shared some grapes with some local cows that were hanging out on the banks of the Ganga, and got all, my arms all mucked up by cow nose. So that was a real Indian experience, I guess. And later I had my first, for the first time, I stepped in cow dung in an urban environment. Which you just don't expect in the West, that you walk down the street in Sydney and step in cow dung. More likely dog poo in Sydney. So that was a real India experience. And then in Mangalore, I was invited up to the ISKCON temple. There was a big celebration at ISKCON and for Krishna, and I don't know, the God was brought out from behind the cabinet and paraded around the temple, and I wasn't sure exactly what's going on, but Krishna Krishna Hari Hari, I know that much, and we had a lot of fun. It was a great time.
Professor Babones, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for the work that you're doing, because as you have mentioned, and as all people who follow data say, that the best way to fight lies is to expose them with truth. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Amit, as well. We will be back again. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.